Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds almost ridiculous until you realize it's absolutely true. 3 different wars that killed millions of people, all because humans couldn't stop obsessing over tiny seeds and tree bark that made their food taste better. Why would anyone massacre entire civilizations for nutmeg? Through the next hour, you'll discover how a spice worth more than gold turned ordinary merchants into genocidal monsters, and by the end, you'll understand why your spice rack represents one of history's bloodiest chapters. Picture this: you're standing in a tropical paradise where the air itself smells like Christmas morning, warm cinnamon, sharp nutmeg, and that distinctive bite of black pepper dancing on ocean breezes. But beneath your feet lies soil soaked with centuries of blood, because what you're smelling isn't just nature's perfume, it's the scent that launched 1,000 ships and ended 1,000,000 lives. You probably won't survive 5 minutes in the brutal world we're about to explore, where a handful of peppercorns could buy you a house, and refusing to hand over your nutmeg trees meant watching your entire family die. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing our global community come together for these nighttime journeys. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're transported back to the early 1600s, sailing through the crystal-clear waters of what Europeans called the Spice Islands. Tiny volcanic dots scattered across the Indonesian archipelago like emeralds on blue silk. The Banda Islands stretched before you, barely 10 specks of land that you could walk across in an afternoon. Yet these insignificant patches of coral and volcanic soil hold something more valuable than any gold mine or diamond deposit ever discovered. Here grows the nutmeg tree, Myristica fragrans, producing 2 of the world's most coveted spices, nutmeg from the seed, and mace from the delicate red covering that wraps around it like nature's own gift packaging. The economics are staggering in their absurdity. A single pound of nutmeg in 17th century London costs more than an entire ox, while a handful of mace could purchase a small house in Amsterdam. European aristocrats literally measure their wealth in nutmegs, keeping individual seeds locked in ornate silver boxes like precious jewels. The Dutch have calculated that controlling just these 10 tiny islands will generate more profit than all their other colonial ventures combined, including their massive sugar plantations in Brazil and their fur trading posts across North America. But you're not alone in these waters. Dutch warships patrol the horizon with cannon ports open, their crews scanning for any vessel that might dare to approach these precious islands without permission. The Dutch East India Company has claimed monopoly rights over every single nutmeg tree, and they're willing to kill anyone who threatens their control, including the people who've been growing these spices for over 1,000 years before any European ever dreamed of setting foot in the tropics. The company's charter, signed by the Dutch government, literally grants them permission to wage war, negotiate treaties, and execute prisoners in the name of commercial profit. The Bandanese people watch your ship approach with a mixture of curiosity and growing dread. They've heard whispers from neighboring islands about what happens when you refuse to cooperate with the Dutch demand for exclusive trading rights. These aren't simple farmers or fishermen. The Bandanese have sophisticated trading networks that stretch from China to Arabia, dealing in multiple currencies and maintaining diplomatic relationships with kingdoms across Southeast Asia. Historians still argue whether the Bandanese truly understood what they were agreeing to when they signed those early treaties, but the documents themselves reveal a deliberate campaign of deception by Dutch negotiators who had no intention of honoring any agreement that didn't serve their monopolistic goals. You smell the nutmeg groves as you step onto the pristine beaches, that distinctive warm, sweet scent that makes you think of holiday cookies and mulled wine. The trees themselves are remarkably unimpressive, standing barely 20 feet tall with glossy leaves that rustle in the constant tropical breeze. But inside their innocent-looking yellow fruits lies the seed that has driven men to madness and nations to war. The harvest process is almost comically labor-intensive. Each fruit must be picked by hand when perfectly ripe, split open to reveal the nutmeg seed wrapped in its lacy mace covering, then carefully dried for months before it's ready for export. But there's something else in the air now, something that makes the tropical birds fall silent and sends crabs scuttling back toward their holes. It's the smell of smoke, and underneath it, something darker that you don't want to identify. The Dutch aren't just here to trade anymore, they're here to own, to control, and to eliminate anyone who stands in their way. Their business model requires absolute monopoly. If even a single nutmeg seed reaches European markets through non-Dutch channels, it threatens their ability to maintain prices that are literally 1,000 times higher than production costs. The tragedy unfolding in these paradise islands would make the Spanish conquest of the Americas look restrained by comparison. Over the next 2 decades, the Dutch would systematically exterminate nearly the entire population of the Banda Islands, reducing a thriving civilization of 15,000 people to fewer than 1,000 survivors. All for the sake of maintaining their monopoly on a spice that most people today keep forgotten in the back of their kitchen cabinets, used maybe twice a year for holiday baking. You're witnessing the opening chapter of humanity's most absurd and deadly obsession, the willingness to commit genocide for the sake of making food taste marginally more interesting. You watch as the Dutch East India Company transforms from a trading enterprise into history's first multinational death machine, wielding corporate power that would make modern tech giants look like corner stores. The year is 1602, and the Dutch have just created something the world has never seen before: a joint stock company with government-granted authority to wage war, establish colonies, and execute anyone who interferes with their business model. Their target? Complete monopolistic control over every nutmeg tree on the planet. The company's strategy is breathtakingly simple and utterly ruthless. Since nutmeg grows naturally on only a handful of tiny islands in the Banda archipelago, controlling those islands means controlling the entire global supply. It's like owning the only oil wells on Earth, except your product weighs almost nothing and can be sold for literally thousands of times its production cost. The Dutch have run the numbers, and they've discovered that eliminating competition through systematic violence generates higher profits than peaceful trade ever could. You're standing in the Amsterdam headquarters of the Dutch East India Company, watching executives pore over maps with the cold precision of military strategists planning an invasion. These aren't swashbuckling pirates or conquistadors driven by dreams of glory. They're accountants and merchants who've calculated that genocide is simply good business. The company's charter explicitly grants them the right to build fortresses, maintain armies, and negotiate treaties as if they were a sovereign nation. Historians still argue whether the Dutch government fully understood they were creating a monster that would eventually become more powerful than most European kingdoms. The Bandanese initially tried to accommodate these strange new trading partners. For over a millennium, they've maintained peaceful commercial relationships with merchants from across the known world. Chinese junks carrying silk and porcelain, Arab dhows loaded with silver and textiles, Javanese traders bringing rice and manufactured goods. The islands operate as a sophisticated free trade zone where multiple currencies are accepted and diplomatic immunity is respected. But the Dutch demand something unprecedented: exclusive rights to every nutmeg and mace produced on the islands, at prices they alone will determine. You witnessed the first treaty signing in 1609, held on the beach of Nara Island under swaying palm trees that seemed to mock the gravity of what's being agreed to. The Bandanese chiefs, dressed in their finest silk sarongs and gold jewelry, believe they're negotiating a standard trading arrangement. The Dutch negotiators, sweating in their heavy black wool coats despite the tropical heat, know they're implementing the first phase of what will become complete territorial conquest. The treaty's language is deliberately vague in the Malay translation, while the Dutch version contains clauses that essentially make the Bandanese subjects of a foreign corporation. The economics become increasingly absurd as Dutch control tightens. A single nutmeg, which costs virtually nothing to produce, sells in European markets for enough money to feed a family for a month. The Dutch maintain these astronomical prices through artificial scarcity. They literally burn mountains of spices in Amsterdam's public squares rather than allow market prices to drop. You're watching the birth of the modern concept of brand monopoly, where controlling supply matters more than meeting demand. But the Bandanese aren't passive victims in this corporate takeover. Many of them are experienced international traders who understand exactly what the Dutch are attempting. Secret meetings convene in hidden jungle clearings where island chiefs plot resistance strategies. They begin smuggling nutmeg seeds to other islands, hoping to break the monopoly by establishing alternative growing regions. some chiefs reach out to Portuguese and English traders, offering better deals in exchange for military protection against Dutch expansion. The Dutch response is swift and merciless. Company forces, led by Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, begin systematically destroying any nutmeg trees found outside their controlled territories. They poison wells, burn villages, and execute anyone caught possessing unauthorized nutmeg seeds. Cohen, a man whose letters home describe mass murder with the same casual tone most people use to discuss weather, implements what he calls the final solution to the nutmeg problem: complete elimination of the Bandanese people as an independent culture. You smell the smoke rising from burning nutmeg groves as Dutch soldiers hack down centuries-old trees with methodical precision. Each tree they destroy represents not just lost income, but the elimination of genetic diversity that took nature thousands of years to develop. The soldiers work with the grim efficiency of men who understand they're not just conquering territory, they're committing botanical genocide, wiping out entire species variants to ensure their corporate masters maintain absolute control over what remains. The psychological warfare becomes as important as the physical violence. Dutch ships patrol the waters between islands, intercepting traditional trading vessels and executing their crews as pirates and smugglers. The message is clear: anyone who challenges Dutch authority will face death, and their families will watch it happen. The company distributes printed pamphlets in multiple languages explaining that resistance is futile and cooperation will be rewarded with positions in the new colonial administration. By 1619, the Dutch East India Company has achieved something unprecedented in human history. A private corporation has successfully conquered an entire archipelago and eliminated most of its population for purely commercial reasons. The few surviving Bandanese are relocated to company-controlled plantations where they work as slaves growing the same spices their ancestors once traded freely. You're witnessing the birth of corporate colonialism, a business model that will spread across the globe and define the next 3 centuries of human suffering. You're about to witness one of history's most efficient genocides, carried out not by religious fanatics or political extremists, but by businessmen armed with spreadsheets and profit margins. The date is May 8, 1621, and Jan Pieterszoon Cohen has just received word that the Bandanese are planning one final act of resistance. His solution is as simple as it is horrifying: kill them all, every single one, and replace them with compliant Dutch colonists who will grow nutmeg without asking awkward questions about freedom or fair wages. The morning air carries the scent of frangipani flowers and wood smoke as you stand on the beach of Lantour Island, watching Dutch soldiers disembark from their landing craft with the mechanical precision of men who've done this before. These aren't wild-eyed conquistadors drunk on dreams of gold. They're professional killers employed by history's first multinational corporation, armed with detailed lists of every Bandanese family and explicit orders to leave no survivors who might someday challenge Dutch authority. Cohen himself oversees the operation from his flagship, a massive warship bristling with cannon that could level entire villages with a single broadside. His personal correspondence, preserved in Dutch archives, reveals a man who views mass murder as just another business expense, necessary for maintaining market share in the competitive spice trade. He writes to his superiors in Amsterdam with the same tone a modern CEO might use to describe laying off redundant employees, regrettable but necessary for long-term profitability. The Bandanese have prepared for this moment, as best they can. Hidden in jungle caves and fortified compounds, they've stockpiled weapons, food, and water for what they know will be their final stand. But they're facing an enemy with overwhelming technological advantages: Dutch muskets, cannon, and steel swords against traditional spears, blowguns, and sheer desperate courage. You watch families say goodbye to each other, knowing that sunrise will bring either freedom or death, with no middle ground possible. The slaughter begins at dawn with a coordinated assault on every major settlement simultaneously. Dutch forces, guided by collaborators promised safety in exchange for betrayal, surround entire villages before their inhabitants can escape into the jungle. The killing is systematic and thorough: men, women, children, elderly, infants, everyone capable of remembering life before Dutch rule must die. Historians still argue whether Cohen's orders explicitly called for total extermination or if field commanders simply interpreted pacification to mean genocide, but the result is identical either way. You smell the smoke from burning houses mixing with something far worse as Dutch soldiers work their way through the villages with methodical efficiency. They've been ordered to destroy not just people, but culture itself. Sacred sites are desecrated, traditional boats are burned, even fruit trees are cut down to prevent survivors from finding food in the jungle. This isn't conquest in the traditional sense. It's the complete erasure of a civilization that has existed for over 1,000 years. The few Bandanese fighters who manage to reach the jungle discover that the Dutch have planned for this possibility too. Company forces have poisoned streams, burned food caches, and established checkpoints at every possible escape route. Trained hunting dogs, brought specifically for tracking human prey, pursue fleeing families through the dense tropical undergrowth. The island itself becomes a death trap where every shadow might hide a Dutch soldier, and every stream might carry poison. Some of the most disturbing accounts come from Dutch soldiers themselves, men who write home describing their disgust at orders that violate every principle of civilized warfare. One sergeant's diary, discovered centuries later, describes finding a cave where dozens of families had hidden their children, hoping that Dutch soldiers might show mercy to the innocent. The diary entry ends with a single line. "We followed our orders completely." The children were bayoneted where they sat, too terrified to even cry out. By the third day, the systematic killing has reached almost industrial efficiency. Dutch forces established processing centers where captured Bandanese are sorted into categories: useful slaves who might be transported to other colonies, local collaborators who will be allowed to live under strict supervision, and everyone else who must die immediately. The sorting process itself becomes a form of psychological torture, as families are separated and individuals forced to watch their loved ones disappear into execution chambers disguised as administrative buildings. The international reaction to the Great Nutmeg Massacre is virtually non-existent. European powers that might normally protest such extreme methods are too busy trying to break the Dutch spice monopoly to waste time on moral concerns. Portuguese and English traders, who had been secretly supporting Bandanese resistance, suddenly discover urgent business elsewhere. Even the Vatican, which has previously condemned colonial excesses, remains conspicuously silent about the systematic extermination of entire Christian communities in the Banda Islands. Within a week, 15,000 Bandanese have been reduced to fewer than 1,000 survivors, most of them children who will be raised as Dutch colonial subjects with no memory of their culture's previous independence. The nutmeg trees, now growing in soil fertilized by the bones of their original cultivators, continue producing their precious spices for Dutch shareholders who never ask awkward questions about how their dividends are earned. You're witnessing the moment when corporate profit officially becomes more valuable than human life, establishing a precedent that will define the next 4 centuries of global capitalism. The efficiency of the massacre becomes a selling point in Dutch business circles. Cohen is promoted and celebrated as a visionary who solved the Bandanese problem, with minimal cost and maximum effectiveness. His methods become the template for corporate colonial expansion worldwide, proving that systematic violence, properly organized and adequately funded, can eliminate any obstacle to commercial success. You're sailing through choppy seas aboard an English privateer's ship in 1664. Watching Captain Nathaniel Butler prepare for what might be the most audacious heist in maritime history, stealing an entire island's worth of nutmeg trees from the Dutch East India Company. The English have spent decades watching Dutch merchants grow obscenely wealthy from their Banda Islands monopoly, and they've finally decided that if they can't negotiate fairly for spices, they'll simply take them by force. The English approach to breaking the Dutch nutmeg stranglehold combines legitimate trade, outright piracy, and botanical espionage in equal measure. You watched Butler's crew prepare for landing on Run Island, one of the few remaining Banda Islands where a handful of English traders maintain a precarious foothold. Their mission sounds almost comically simple: steal nutmeg seedlings, smuggle them to English-controlled territories, and establish alternative plantations that will crash Dutch prices through good old-fashioned competition. But the Dutch aren't making this easy. Every English ship in Indonesian waters is considered a pirate vessel, subject to immediate attack without warning or trial. Dutch patrol boats, armed with cannon and filled with soldiers who've learned their trade in the Bandinese massacres, hunt English merchants with the same ruthless efficiency they once applied to genocide. You smell gunpowder in the air as your ship's lookout spots Dutch sails on the horizon, forcing another desperate chase through reef-strewn waters where one navigation error means death on jagged coral. The economics driving this maritime cat-and-mouse game are staggering. A single successful nutmeg smuggling voyage can generate enough profit to buy an entire English manor house, complete with lands and title. Investors in London coffee houses place bets on which captains will return with stolen spice cargoes and which will end up decorating Dutch gibbets as examples to other would-be smugglers. The English government officially condemns piracy while secretly issuing letters of marque that legalize attacks on Dutch commercial shipping. You witness one of history's strangest diplomatic negotiations when English and Dutch representatives meet on neutral Javanese territory to discuss trading rights. The Dutch negotiator arrives with detailed accounts of every English piracy incident, demanding compensation for stolen cargoes and executed crews. The English representative counters with equally detailed records of Dutch monopolistic practices and genocide, arguing that their actions constitute legitimate resistance to corporate tyranny. Historians still argue whether these negotiations were genuine diplomatic efforts or elaborate theater designed to justify continued warfare. The botanical espionage reaches almost ridiculous levels of complexity. English agents, disguised as Portuguese missionaries or Arab traders, infiltrate Dutch-controlled islands with the sole mission of stealing a handful of nutmeg seeds. These aren't just any seeds. They need to be fresh, viable specimens that can survive the months-long voyage to English colonies without losing their ability to germinate. The Dutch, well aware of these efforts, post guards around nutmeg groves and execute anyone caught with unauthorized seeds, regardless of their claimed nationality or religious status. One of the most successful English nutmeg pirates is Francis Drake's lesser-known cousin, Captain James Lancaster, who develops an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever Dutch defenses are weakest. His ship, appropriately named the Nutmeg, becomes legendary for its ability to vanish into island maze systems where larger Dutch warships cannot follow. Lancaster's crew includes several former Bandinese survivors who provide detailed knowledge of hidden anchorages and secret paths through the jungle. You're hiding in a mangrove swamp, watching Lancaster's men carefully dig up young nutmeg saplings under cover of darkness while Dutch patrol boats search the nearby lagoons with torches and hunting dogs. The operation requires perfect timing. The trees must be transplanted immediately to specially prepared soil aboard ship, kept watered and shaded during the voyage, and planted in similar tropical conditions thousands of miles away. Most attempts fail, leaving English investors with expensive piles of dead wood instead of profitable spice plantations. The Dutch response to English piracy becomes increasingly paranoid and brutal. Governor-General Maetswicker issues standing orders to execute any English sailor found in Indonesian waters, even those carrying legitimate trading licenses from other European powers. Dutch ships begin attacking vessels flying Spanish, Portuguese, and even French flags if they're suspected of carrying English passengers or nutmeg contraband. The spice trade transforms into an undeclared war where merchant ships require military escorts, and commercial negotiations are conducted at Cannon Point. The breakthrough comes in 1667 when English forces successfully establish nutmeg plantations in Grenada, using seeds smuggled from the Banda Islands in a daring raid that cost 3 ships and 47 lives. The trees thrive in Caribbean soil, producing spices that are chemically identical to their Indonesian cousins but completely outside Dutch control. For the first time in over 60 years, nutmeg reaches European markets without Dutch middlemen taking their massive cut. The Dutch reaction is swift and predictably violent. Company forces launch immediate attacks on English settlements throughout the Caribbean, attempting to destroy the rival plantations before they can mature enough to threaten Dutch prices. But it's too late. The botanical secrets are out, and English colonial governors begin offering massive bounties for anyone who can successfully establish spice cultivation in their territories. You watch Dutch stock prices plummet in Amsterdam exchanges as news spreads that their nutmeg monopoly has been broken. Shareholders who had grown wealthy from what seemed like guaranteed profits suddenly discover that their investments are vulnerable to simple competition. Some of the same merchants who had celebrated Cohen's massacres as necessary business expenses now rage against English theft of what they consider rightfully Dutch property, apparently seeing no irony in their position. The English success with stolen nutmeg plants establishes a new pattern in colonial competition. Instead of negotiating for trading rights or establishing peaceful commercial relationships, European powers begin systematically stealing each other's agricultural secrets through espionage and violence. The botanical warfare spreads to other valuable crops: coffee, tea, rubber, cocaine, as nations realize that controlling plant genetics can be more profitable than controlling territory. You're standing in the bustling markets of ancient Rome circa 50 AD, watching a merchant carefully weigh out peppercorns one by one as if each tiny sphere contains fragments of pure gold. Because in this world, that's essentially what they are. Black pepper commands prices so astronomical that Roman soldiers receive part of their wages in peppercorns, and wealthy families display bowls of the precious spices in their atriums like other people might show off marble sculptures or fine jewelry. The Roman obsession with black pepper reaches levels that would make modern luxury addicts seem restrained by comparison. A single pound of quality Malabar pepper costs the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Yet demand continues growing as Roman cuisine becomes increasingly sophisticated and competitive. You watch aristocratic dinner parties where the amount of pepper in each dish serves as a not-so-subtle display of the host's wealth and social status. The more pepper, the more impressive your connections to the mysterious spice traders who risk their lives crossing dangerous seas to bring these tiny treasures from India's remote southwestern coast. But pepper isn't just about flavor or social posturing. It's literally currency in a world where reliable money is scarce and international trade requires portable, universally accepted value. Roman merchants traveling to Germania or Gaul carry pepper instead of coins, knowing that these small, lightweight spices will be accepted anywhere civilized people gather. The Latin phrase, "worth its weight in pepper," becomes the ancient equivalent of "worth its weight in gold." Except pepper is actually more valuable per ounce than most precious metals. The spice's medicinal reputation adds another layer to its mystique and market value. Roman physicians prescribed pepper for everything from digestive problems to respiratory ailments, claiming that the heating properties of the spice can balance the body's humors and cure diseases that would otherwise prove fatal. You watch wealthy Romans consume pepper-laced remedies with the same fervor that modern people might take expensive supplements, convinced that these exotic spices possess almost magical healing powers unavailable from local herbs. The journey that brings pepper from Indian plantations to Roman tables reads like an adventure novel filled with pirates, storms, and exotic kingdoms. Merchants must travel overland through territories controlled by hostile tribes, cross seas infested with pirates, and navigate complex diplomatic relationships with dozens of different rulers who each demand tribute for safe passage. A single pepper trading expedition might take 3 years to complete, with no guarantee that ships, cargo, or crew will survive to reach their destination. You're transported to the pepper plantations of Kerala's Malabar coast, watching local farmers tend their precious vines with the same care that Roman nobles lavish on their prize racehorses. These aren't simple agricultural operations. Pepper cultivation requires sophisticated knowledge of climate, soil conditions, and plant biology that has been developed over centuries of trial and error. The vines must be carefully trained up support trees, harvested at precisely the right moment, and processed using techniques that determine whether the final product will command premium prices or end up as worthless dust. Roman demand for pepper drives the development of some of history's first truly international trade networks. You watch Indian Ocean ports bustling with ships flying dozens of different flags: Roman galleys, Arab dhows, Chinese junks, and local Indonesian vessels all converging on pepper warehouses where fortunes change hands daily. These trading hubs become cosmopolitan centers where multiple languages, currencies, and legal systems somehow coexist in the pursuit of profit from small brown spheres that most people have never actually tasted. The strategic importance of pepper leads to some of the ancient world's most complex diplomatic arrangements. Roman emperors maintained permanent ambassadors in Indian courts specifically to negotiate pepper trading rights, while Indian kingdoms played different Roman factions against each other to maximize their profits from spice exports. You witness treaty negotiations where military alliances and territorial agreements take second place to clauses guaranteeing pepper supply quotas and price protections. But the pepper trade's dark side emerges as demand creates markets for forced labor and territorial conquest. Roman-backed merchants begin establishing fortified trading posts along the Indian coast, using local political conflicts as excuses to insert themselves into regional wars as arms dealers and mercenaries. The transformation from peaceful trade to colonial domination follows a depressingly familiar pattern. First come the merchants, then the soldiers, finally the governors who claim permanent authority over territories that were supposed to be temporary trading partners. Historians still argue whether the Roman appetite for pepper contributed to the empire's eventual collapse by draining gold reserves to pay for luxury imports. Contemporary accounts describe shiploads of Roman gold leaving Mediterranean ports in exchange for relatively small quantities of spices, creating a massive trade deficit that some economists blame for currency debasement and inflation. The irony is staggering. An empire that conquered most of the known world might have been economically weakened by its citizens' addiction to making their food taste slightly more interesting. You watch Roman dinner parties where pepper has become so commonplace among the wealthy that hosts compete to serve increasingly exotic spice combinations imported from even more remote locations. The pepper that once seemed impossibly rare and valuable now appears ordinary compared to cardamom from Ceylon, cinnamon from Madagascar, or ginger from distant China. The constant escalation of spice luxury creates a market dynamic that will eventually drive European exploration, colonialism, and centuries of warfare, all because people wanted their meals to taste better than their neighbors. The Roman pepper obsession establishes patterns that will repeat throughout history whenever powerful civilizations encounter exotic luxury goods. The initial fascination with novelty transforms into social competition, which creates artificial demand that far exceeds practical necessity, leading to international trade networks that become strategic vulnerabilities when supply chains are disrupted by war or natural disaster. You're witnessing one of history's most bizarre ransom negotiations, taking place in the smoky Great Hall of a medieval castle where an English baron counts out peppercorns one by one to pay for his city's freedom. The year is 1410. And the besieging army outside the walls has agreed to lift their siege in exchange for what sounds like a culinary ingredient but represents more wealth than most kingdoms possess: 3,000 pounds of black pepper, carefully weighed and verified for quality by expert spice merchants who have traveled hundreds of miles specifically for this transaction. Medieval Europe's pepper obsession makes Roman consumption look positively restrained by comparison. You watch nobles literally measure their social status in peppercorns, displaying ornate pepper mills made from precious metals at banquets where the amount of spice used in each dish communicates political messages more clearly than any formal diplomacy. A heavily peppered meal announces that your host possesses international trading connections, vast liquid wealth, and enough confidence in their security to waste precious resources on flavoring that could otherwise buy armies or build cathedrals. The economics become increasingly surreal as pepper transforms from luxury seasoning into medieval Europe's most reliable form of stored wealth. Banks accept peppercorns as collateral for loans, dowries are calculated in pepper weights, and inheritance disputes center on who controls the family spice reserves. You're standing in the London Guildhall watching pepper merchants who wield political influence comparable to modern oil executives, their warehouses guarded by private armies and their trading routes protected by naval treaties between major European powers. Medieval physicians elevate pepper to near mystical status as a cure-all remedy that can allegedly treat everything from the plague to impotence. Medical texts describe elaborate pepper-based treatments that read more like alchemical formulas than practical medicine. Specific combinations of black pepper, long pepper, and white pepper mixed with wine, honey, and ground pearls to create potions that wealthy patients consume at costs that would bankrupt entire villages. The medical demand creates yet another market layer that drives prices even higher than culinary uses alone could justify. But the real pepper wars begin when European nobles discover that controlling spice trade routes generates more reliable income than traditional feudal agriculture. You watch the development of medieval Europe's first international crime syndicates as competing merchant families wage literal wars over pepper importing rights. The Venetian pepper cartels employed private armies to attack rival Genoese spice convoys, while German trading leagues establish fortified warehouses that look more like military fortresses than commercial facilities. The Hanseatic League transforms pepper trading into something resembling modern organized crime, complete with territorial divisions, protection rackets, and extremely violent responses to competition. You're hiding in the shadows of a Hamburg warehouse district, watching pepper merchants negotiate with the same tense formality that characterizes modern drug deals. Everyone armed, everyone suspicious, and everyone aware that fortunes large enough to buy entire cities are changing hands based on the quality and quantity of small brown spheres stored in locked chests. Pepper piracy becomes a legitimate career path for younger sons of noble families who can't inherit land but possess enough capital to outfit armed ships for spice raids. These aren't desperate criminals driven by poverty. They're well-educated entrepreneurs who've calculated that attacking pepper convoys generates higher returns than any legal investment available in medieval Europe. You watch elegantly dressed young aristocrats plan spice heists with the same careful attention to detail that their fathers might devote to military campaigns or diplomatic negotiations. The Church finds itself in an awkward position regarding the pepper trade's obvious moral problems. Officially, Christianity condemns the violence and exploitation involved in spice trading, but practically, every major cathedral, monastery, and religious institution depends on pepper-wealthy donors for funding. You witness papal negotiations where religious leaders perform elaborate mental gymnastics to justify accepting donations from merchants whose wealth obviously derives from activities that violate multiple commandments about greed, violence, and exploitation of the poor. Medieval recipe books reveal pepper's role in what might be history's first international arms race based on culinary competition. Noble kitchens compete to create increasingly complex spice combinations that demonstrate their access to the rarest and most expensive ingredients available. A single feast might consume pepper worth more than a typical farmer's lifetime earnings, not because the food tastes proportionally better, but because conspicuous consumption of expensive spices communicates political messages about wealth, power, and international connections. The pepper trade's political implications become clear when European kings begin planning military expeditions specifically to secure alternative spice routes. The Crusades, officially religious wars to reclaim holy sites, include barely concealed economic motives related to controlling Mediterranean pepper trading routes. You watch royal councils where military strategists discuss siege tactics and diplomatic alliances in the same meetings where they debate optimal pepper storage techniques and spice convoy protection strategies. Historians still argue whether medieval Europe's pepper obsession contributed to the social instability that eventually destroyed feudalism. The traditional land-based wealth of the nobility suddenly seemed less secure compared to the liquid wealth of pepper merchants, who could relocate their assets when political situations became unfavorable. You witnessed the emergence of a new merchant class whose economic power derives from international trade rather than agricultural production, creating tensions that will eventually explode into social revolutions across Europe. The irony becomes impossible to ignore. Medieval European civilization, supposedly based on Christian values of humility and spiritual devotion, increasingly organizes itself around the pursuit of luxury seasonings that serve no practical purpose beyond making food taste marginally more interesting. The same nobles who preach about the dangers of worldly temptation compete frantically to acquire spices that represent pure material indulgence, creating moral contradictions that will eventually contribute to major religious and political upheavals. Remember that nutmeg massacre we discussed earlier? Medieval pepper wars established the precedent that luxury spices justify almost unlimited violence, setting the stage for even more brutal conflicts when Europeans encounter other exotic seasonings that seem to promise similar profits. You're standing on the deck of Vasco da Gama's flagship in 1502, watching the Portuguese admiral prepare for what will become history's first systematic campaign to militarize the spice trade through strategic violence. Da Gama has returned to Indian waters not as an explorer seeking new routes, but as a conqueror determined to seize control of the pepper trade through a combination of naval warfare, diplomatic terrorism, an economic blockade that will transform peaceful commercial relationships into centuries of colonial warfare. The Portuguese strategy is breathtakingly simple and utterly ruthless. Destroy existing Arab and Indian trading networks, establish fortified bases at strategic choke points, and force all pepper commerce to flow through Portuguese-controlled channels where they can extract maximum profit through monopolistic pricing. You watch da Gama's officers study detailed maps showing every major pepper port along India's southwestern coast, marking targets for bombardment with the same methodical precision that modern military planners might use to identify strategic bombing objectives. The economic motivation driving this maritime conquest becomes clear when you examine the numbers involved. A single successful pepper voyage from India to Lisbon generates profits equivalent to the entire annual tax revenue of a medium-sized European kingdom. Portuguese investors have calculated that even if 9 out of 10 ships are lost to storms, pirates, or warfare, the surviving cargo will still generate enough wealth to justify the enormous costs of maintaining permanent naval forces in the Indian Ocean. But the Portuguese face a fundamental problem. They're attempting to conquer established trading networks that have operated successfully for over 1,000 years without European involvement. The Malabar Coast pepper merchants maintain sophisticated relationships with Arab financiers, Indian princes, Chinese buyers, and Southeast Asian distributors who have no interest in Portuguese interference with their profitable businesses. You witness the first clashes between Portuguese cannon and traditional Arab dhows, watching centuries of peaceful commerce dissolve into maritime warfare over control of small brown spheres that grow on jungle vines. Da Gama's opening move demonstrates the Portuguese approach to spice diplomacy. He captures a pilgrim ship returning from Mecca, locks 800 innocent passengers in the hold, and burns them alive as a message to Indian Ocean traders about what happens when Portuguese commercial demands are refused. The massacre serves no military purpose. It's pure terrorism designed to convince established merchants that cooperation with Portuguese monopoly efforts will be less costly than resistance. You're transported to the bustling spice markets of Calicut, watching local pepper merchants receive news of Portuguese demands with a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. These aren't primitive traders easily intimidated by European technology. They're sophisticated international businessmen whose commercial networks stretch from Venice to Beijing. Many of them are wealthier than Portuguese nobility and command resources that dwarf what da Gama's expedition can bring to bear. But they're about to discover that Europeans approach commercial competition with levels of violence that civilized societies typically reserve for religious wars. The Portuguese established their first fortified trading post at Cochin in 1503, immediately demonstrating their intentions by attacking neighboring pepper warehouses and executing merchants who refused to sell exclusively to Portuguese buyers at predetermined prices. The local Raja, initially welcoming to these new customers, discovers that Portuguese trade agreements actually function as military occupation contracts where European cannon enforce commercial terms that amount to legalized theft. Portuguese naval tactics revolutionized maritime warfare by treating merchant ships as legitimate military targets rather than neutral commercial vessels protected by traditional laws of the sea. You watch Portuguese warships systematically attack Arab trading fleets, not to capture valuable cargo, but simply to eliminate competition by making pepper commerce too dangerous for anyone except heavily armed Portuguese convoys. The strategy works. Within 5 years, Arab merchants largely abandoned the pepper trade rather than risk constant attack by Portuguese pirates operating with official government sanction. The diplomatic consequences spread far beyond the Indian Ocean as Portuguese pepper wars disrupt established international relationships throughout the known world. Venetian merchants, who had previously dominated European spice importation through peaceful trade with Arab intermediaries, suddenly find their supply chains severed by Portuguese naval blockades. The Ottoman Empire, losing significant customs revenue from disrupted spice transit, begins planning military responses to Portuguese aggression in waters they consider part of their commercial sphere of influence. Historians still argue whether Portuguese success in the Pepper Wars resulted from superior naval technology, or simply greater willingness to use extreme violence against civilian targets. Portuguese ships carry heavier cannon than their competitors, but more importantly, they operate under rules of engagement that permit attacking unarmed merchant vessels, bombarding cities without warning, and executing prisoners to terrorize survivors. The combination of technological advantage and unlimited brutality proves devastatingly effective against societies that still observe traditional limitations on commercial warfare. You witness the transformation of peaceful pepper cultivation as Portuguese demands force Indian farmers to abandon traditional agricultural practices in favor of intensive monoculture designed to maximize export production. Pepper vines that once grew as part of diverse forest ecosystems are now planted in regimented rows like military formations, tended by workers whose labor conditions increasingly resemble slavery rather than traditional agricultural employment. The Portuguese pepper monopoly establishes precedents that will define European colonialism for the next 4 centuries. The idea that superior military technology justifies seizing control of other people's natural resources, the practice of using terrorism against civilians to enforce commercial agreements, and the transformation of international trade from cooperative enterprise into zero-sum warfare. All of these colonial patterns emerge first in the Portuguese campaign to control pepper production and distribution. Portuguese success in militarizing the pepper trade attracts attention from other European powers who begin planning their own spice conquest expeditions. Spanish, Dutch, English, and French merchants study Portuguese methods with the same careful attention that modern corporations might devote to analyzing successful business models, preparing to apply similar combinations of violence and economic pressure to other valuable spices in different parts of the world. You're crouched behind a palm tree on a blood-soaked beach near Cojicote in 1504, watching Portuguese cannons reduce another ancient pepper warehouse to smoking rubble, while local merchants flee into the jungle carrying whatever spices they can salvage from centuries-old family businesses. The Malabar coast has become a war zone where every pepper transaction potentially triggers naval bombardments, and peaceful spice farmers find themselves caught between Portuguese demands for exclusive trading rights and traditional Arab partners who've been their customers for over 800 years. The transformation of Kerala's pepper coast from commercial paradise to battlefield happens with shocking speed as Portuguese forces systematically target every non-European spice operation. You watch Admiral Alfonso de Albuquerque's fleet methodically work its way along the coastline, bombarding ports, burning warehouses, and executing merchants whose only crime was selling pepper to buyers the Portuguese consider competition. The strategy is designed to create artificial scarcity that will drive up prices while eliminating any alternative to Portuguese-controlled supply chains. Local rulers initially attempt diplomatic solutions to Portuguese aggression, offering tribute payments and exclusive trading concessions in exchange for peace. The Zamran of Calicut, one of India's most powerful spice merchants, proposes a partnership arrangement where Portuguese ships would receive preferred status and favorable prices without requiring the destruction of existing commercial relationships. But Portuguese negotiators make it clear that they're not interested in sharing the pepper trade. They want complete control, even if achieving it requires eliminating everyone else involved in spice commerce. You witness one of history's strangest naval battles as traditional Arab dhows, designed for cargo transport rather than warfare, attempt to defend pepper convoys against Portuguese warships armed with cannon that can sink merchant vessels from distances where traditional weapons are useless. The sight is both tragic and absurd. Elegant sailing ships loaded with precious spices being blown apart by European artillery while their crews fight back with arrows and boarding axes that might have been effective centuries earlier but prove worthless against gunpowder weapons. The economic devastation spreads far beyond the immediate combat zones as Portuguese pepper monopolization disrupts traditional agricultural cycles that have sustained Malabar coast communities for generations. Farmers who previously grew pepper as part of diverse crop rotations are forced to concentrate exclusively on spice production for Portuguese buyers, making their communities vulnerable to food shortages if pepper harvests fail or if Portuguese ships are delayed by weather or warfare. Portuguese colonial administrators implement what they call the cartas system, essentially protection rackets where local merchants must purchase expensive licenses to engage in any commercial activity, with the understanding that unlicensed traders will be treated as pirates subject to immediate execution. You watch Portuguese officials collect these tribute payments with the same casual efficiency that modern tax collectors might process routine paperwork, except the penalties for non-compliance include having your entire family killed and your property confiscated. The resistance that emerges combines traditional Indian warfare with desperate improvisation as local rulers realize that Portuguese expansion threatens not just commercial independence but cultural survival. The legendary warrior Kunjali Marakar begins organizing systematic attacks on Portuguese installations, using knowledge of local waters and weather patterns to offset Portuguese advantages in naval technology. His fleet of modified fishing boats, equipped with whatever weapons can be manufactured locally, wages guerrilla warfare against one of Europe's most advanced naval forces. You're hiding in mangrove swamps near Kannur, watching Marakar's fighters prepare fire ships loaded with pepper powder that will explode when ignited, creating improvised weapons from the same spices that Portuguese forces are trying to control. The irony is perfect. Pepper that Europeans consider so valuable they're willing to commit genocide to control it becomes a weapon against the would-be monopolists, literally blowing up in their faces when local defenders get creative with explosive potential. The psychological warfare becomes as important as the military campaigns as both sides attempt to terrorize opposing civilian populations into submission. Portuguese forces execute captured pepper farmers as examples to discourage local cooperation with resistance movements, while Indian guerrilla fighters attack Portuguese settlements to demonstrate that European technological advantages don't guarantee personal safety for colonial administrators and their families. Historians still argue whether the Portuguese pepper wars represent genuine military conquest, or simply large-scale organized crime with government backing. The distinction becomes increasingly meaningless as Portuguese, commercial, activities become indistinguishable from piracy, extortion, and territorial occupation enforced through systematic violence against anyone who challenges their monopolistic demands. The environmental consequences of militarized pepper cultivation begin emerging as Portuguese demands for maximum production force farmers to abandon sustainable agricultural practices that had preserved soil fertility for centuries. Ancient pepper vines, some over 200 years old, are destroyed to make room for intensive plantations designed to maximize short-term yields rather than long-term ecological stability. Portuguese success in controlling Malabar pepper production attracts imitators throughout the Indian Ocean as other European powers recognize that systematic violence can generate commercial advantages unavailable through peaceful trade. Dutch, English, and French merchants begin planning their own spice conquest expeditions, studying Portuguese methods while preparing to apply similar tactics to other valuable crops in different regions. The transformation of international commerce from cooperative enterprise to military occupation establishes patterns that will define European colonialism worldwide. The idea that superior weapons justify seizing control of other people's natural resources, the practice of eliminating local competitors through state-sponsored terrorism, and the conversion of traditional agricultural systems into export-oriented monocultures. All of these colonial strategies emerge first in Portuguese campaigns to monopolize pepper production along India's southwestern coast. You watch the last independent pepper merchants loading their families onto fishing boats, fleeing ancestral lands that have become too dangerous for anyone who refuses to submit to Portuguese commercial demands. Their departure marks the end of over a millennium of peaceful international spice trade, replaced by a system where military force determines commercial relationships and profit margins are calculated in human lives rather than simple monetary costs. You're standing ankle-deep in blood-stained sand on a beach near Colombo in 1510, counting bodies while Portuguese soldiers methodically loot another destroyed pepper warehouse that hours earlier had been a thriving family business passed down through 12 generations. The Pepper Coast War has entered its most brutal phase, where the distinction between military targets and civilian merchants has completely disappeared, and Portuguese commanders openly discuss the benefits of depopulating entire regions to eliminate competition for spice trading. The casualty numbers from these forgotten pepper conflicts would shock modern audiences if anyone bothered to count them. Conservative estimates suggest that Portuguese pepper monopolization campaigns killed over 50,000 people along the Malabar coast between 1502 and 1515. Not soldiers, but farmers, merchants, sailors, and their families whose only crime was participating in commercial relationships that predated European arrival by centuries. These aren't deaths from disease or accident. Their deliberate killings designed to terrorize survivors into submission. You witnessed the siege of Pantaleone Column, where Portuguese forces surround an entire city primarily because its merchants refused to sell pepper exclusively to European buyers. The siege lasts 8 months, during which Portuguese cannons systematically destroy every building while naval blockades prevent food shipments from reaching the starving population. When the city finally surrenders, Portuguese commanders execute every adult male and sell the women and children into slavery, not as punishment for military resistance, but as a business decision to eliminate future competition. The psychological impact spreads far beyond the immediate combat zones as news of Portuguese brutality reaches pepper-growing communities throughout Kerala. You watch entire villages abandon their ancestral lands rather than risk being caught in the crossfire between Portuguese forces and local resistance fighters. The refugee crisis creates additional humanitarian disasters as displaced pepper farmers, carrying whatever possessions they can manage, flee into unfamiliar territories where they lack land, water rights, or social connections necessary for survival. Portuguese colonial records, preserved in Lisbon archives, reveal the bureaucratic banality of genocide as administrators file routine reports about pacification operations and commercial normalization efforts that euphemistically describe systematic massacres. One particularly chilling document recommends eliminating all inhabitants of pepper-growing regions over age 12, reasoning that younger children can be raised as loyal Portuguese subjects while older individuals retain dangerous memories of pre-colonial independence. The resistance movements that emerge combine traditional Indian military tactics with desperate innovation as local commanders realize they're fighting for cultural survival rather than simple commercial advantage. Zamboan naval forces begin using modified pepper-carrying vessels as fire ships, loading them with combustible spices and sailing them directly into Portuguese battle formations where the resulting explosions can destroy multiple enemy warships simultaneously. You're hiding in jungle undergrowth near Kozhikode, watching guerrilla fighters prepare pepper powder bombs that will blind and choke Portuguese soldiers during night raids on colonial installations. The irony is perfect. The same spices that Europeans consider valuable enough to justify genocide become weapons against the colonizers when local defenders get creative with chemical warfare possibilities that Portuguese military manuals never anticipated. The economic warfare extends beyond direct violence as Portuguese forces systematically destroy pepper processing infrastructure to prevent local communities from adding value to their crops. Traditional spice drying facilities, some dating back centuries, are burned not for military advantage but to force farmers to sell raw pepper at lower prices rather than processed spices that command premium rates in international markets. The environmental destruction reaches levels that horrify even Portuguese observers as military campaigns deliberately target agricultural systems that have sustained local populations for over 1,000 years. Ancient pepper vines, some older than European Christianity, are cut down not to clear land for Portuguese plantations but simply to deny local communities any independent source of income that might fund continued resistance. Historians still argue whether Portuguese pepper wars represent the first example of modern corporate colonialism or simply large-scale piracy with government backing, but contemporary documents make clear that Portuguese administrators view mass murder as a routine business expense necessary for maintaining market share and competitive international commerce. The casual tone of reports describing village massacres resembles modern corporate communications about restructuring operations or eliminating redundant personnel. The international reaction to Portuguese pepper atrocities is virtually non-existent as other European powers focus on planning their own spice conquest expeditions rather than condemning methods they intend to copy in different regions. Venetian merchants, whose traditional Arab trading partners are being systematically exterminated, quietly begin negotiating directly with Portuguese suppliers rather than risk moral condemnation that might interfere with their own commercial interests. The cultural destruction accompanying military conquest proves even more devastating than the immediate violence as Portuguese forces deliberately eliminate libraries, schools, and religious institutions that preserve local knowledge about sustainable pepper cultivation techniques developed over centuries of careful experimentation. The loss of this agricultural wisdom will create long-term environmental problems that persist even after political control changes hands. You watch the last traditional pepper merchant in Kundr loading his remaining inventory onto a small boat, preparing to abandon lands his family has farmed since before the birth of Christ rather than submit to Portuguese monopoly demands that would reduce him from independent businessman to contract laborer working for foreign corporations. His departure symbolizes the end of an economic system that had successfully balanced commercial profit with environmental sustainability and social stability for over a millennium. The precedent established by Portuguese pepper wars, that superior military technology justifies eliminating local competitors for control of natural resources, will be copied by every subsequent European colonial venture, from Dutch nutmeg monopolies to British tea plantations to French rubber forests, creating a pattern of violence that will define the next 4 centuries of global economic development. You're crouching in a monsoon-soaked Ceylon jungle circa 1638. Breathing air so thick with cinnamon fragrance that every inhalation tastes like dessert, while Dutch soldiers hack through precious cassia trees with the systematic efficiency of accountants balancing ledgers. The Cinnamon Wars have begun in earnest, and you're witnessing the birth of what will become the most protracted spice conflict in colonial history, a century-long bloodbath over sweet-smelling bark that European aristocrats consider essential for their morning pastries and mulled wine. The obsession with Ceylon cinnamon reaches levels of madness that make pepper wars look like polite commercial disagreements. European royal courts literally measure national prestige by their access to authentic cinnamon, not the cheaper cassia bark that Chinese and Indonesian suppliers have been passing off as the real thing for decades. You watched Portuguese colonial administrators in Colombo frantically calculating shipping schedules because a delayed cinnamon cargo could mean the difference between Portuguese diplomatic success and humiliating failure when negotiating marriage alliances between European royal families who judged potential partners partly by the quality of spices they can provide for wedding feasts. The Dutch East India Company's decision to challenge Portuguese cinnamon monopoly stems from cold financial analysis rather than patriotic ambition. Company directors in Amsterdam have calculated that controlling Ceylon's cinnamon production could generate profits exceeding the entire annual budget of most European nations. The mathematics are staggering. A single pound of high-quality Ceylon cinnamon sells in European markets for more than a skilled craftsman's yearly wages, and the island produces thousands of pounds annually from wild trees that require minimal cultivation investment. You're hiding behind a massive cinnamon tree near Negombo, watching Dutch reconnaissance teams methodically map every grove and plantation while Portuguese guards patrol nearby paths, completely unaware that their monopoly is being surveyed for systematic conquest. The Dutch approach to cinnamon warfare combines their legendary commercial ruthlessness with military innovations developed during their successful rebellion against Spanish rule. They understand that controlling cinnamon requires not just defeating Portuguese forces but also winning the loyalty of local Sinhalese and Tamil communities who actually harvest the bark. The initial Dutch strategy relies on exploiting Portuguese colonial incompetence rather than direct military confrontation. Portuguese administrators have spent decades alienating local cinnamon workers by imposing arbitrary quotas, refusing to pay fair wages, and treating traditional harvesting families as indentured servants rather than skilled artisans whose generations of experience are essential for sustainable production. You watch Dutch agents quietly recruiting disgruntled cinnamon peelers who know exactly when to harvest bark for optimal flavor and aroma, knowledge that Portuguese colonizers never bothered learning because they assumed European supervision was more valuable than local expertise. The religious dimension adds another layer of complexity as Dutch Protestant forces fight Catholic Portuguese colonizers while both sides attempt to convert local Buddhist and Hindu populations who view the conflict as a foreign quarrel that unfortunately happens to be destroying their traditional livelihoods. Local temple records, written on palm leaves and hidden in monastery archives, describe the demon wars, where pale-skinned foreigners kill each other over tree bark while ignoring the spiritual significance of cinnamon in ancient Ayurvedic medicine and religious ceremonies. The environmental warfare reaches unprecedented levels of sophistication as both sides realize that controlling cinnamon trees matters more than controlling territory. Portuguese forces begin systematic destruction of wild cinnamon groves to prevent Dutch access, while Dutch commandos sneak through jungle paths to establish secret plantations in remote mountain valleys where Portuguese patrols never venture. You're crawling through undergrowth near Kandy, watching Dutch soldiers carefully transplant young cinnamon trees to hidden locations that will supply their forces even if Portuguese defenders destroy all visible plantations. The economic sabotage extends beyond agriculture as both sides target each other's processing facilities, shipping warehouses, and trading posts in a commercial war that treats cinnamon infrastructure as legitimate military objectives. The Dutch innovation of using local fishing boats disguised as harmless commercial vessels to transport military supplies creates a guerrilla logistics network that Portuguese naval forces cannot effectively counter without alienating every coastal community that depends on fishing for survival. Historians still argue whether Dutch cinnamon strategy represents military genius or simple commercial opportunism, but contemporary Dutch East India Company records reveal careful planning that treats Ceylon conquest as a long-term investment project rather than a quick military campaign. Company directors understand that sustainable cinnamon profits require establishing stable relationships with local communities rather than the Portuguese approach of terrorizing workers into submission through violence and intimidation. The cultural dimension of cinnamon warfare creates bizarre situations where European soldiers fight each other while local communities continue traditional festivals celebrating the cinnamon harvest, treating the colonial conflict as an incomprehensible interruption of ancient seasonal rhythms. You attend a village celebration near Gao where Tamil cinnamon workers perform traditional dances honoring tree spirits, while Dutch and Portuguese cannon fire echoes in the distance. A surreal juxtaposition of spiritual reverence and commercial violence that captures the fundamental absurdity of Europeans killing each other over aromatic tree bark. The international implications grow more complex as other European powers begin planning their own Ceylon interventions, recognizing that cinnamon control could shift the balance of continental politics. French intelligence networks start mapping Dutch defensive positions while English privateers probe Portuguese shipping routes, transforming a bilateral colonial conflict into a multilateral competition that will eventually draw in every major European naval power. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from our nutmeg adventures? Well, Ceylon's climate proves even more challenging for European soldiers who must fight through monsoon seasons while dealing with tropical diseases, venomous snakes, and local resistance fighters who know every jungle path and river crossing. The precedent of treating agricultural resources as strategic military assets will reshape European thinking about colonial conquest, establishing the principle that controlling spice production requires permanent occupation rather than simple trading post agreements. This shift toward territorial colonialism represents a fundamental change in European imperial strategy that will define the next 3 centuries of global expansion. You're pressed against a rain-soaked tree trunk in the Candian highlands during the monsoon season of 1656, watching Dutch commandos move through cinnamon groves with the silent precision of professional assassins while Portuguese sentries huddle miserably in their makeshift fortifications, completely unaware that their empire's most profitable colony is being systematically dismantled around them. The Dutch-Portuguese cinnamon conflict has evolved into something unprecedented in colonial warfare. A jungle campaign where traditional European military tactics prove utterly useless against an enemy that treats every cinnamon tree as both commercial asset and strategic fortification. The Dutch military innovation that revolutionizes spice warfare involves abandoning conventional European battle formations in favor of guerrilla tactics learned from local Sinhalese fighters who've been resisting Portuguese occupation for over a century. You watch Dutch officers studying traditional Candian military manuals, written in ancient Sinhala script, that describe techniques for jungle ambushes, monsoon season logistics, and psychological warfare specifically designed for Ceylon's unique terrain and climate conditions. The irony is delicious. European colonizers learning indigenous military wisdom to fight other Europeans over the right to exploit indigenous resources. The economic warfare reaches levels of sophistication that would impress modern corporate strategists as Dutch agents systematically corrupt Portuguese supply chains through bribery, sabotage, and misinformation campaigns designed to create artificial shortages in Portuguese-controlled territories. You're hidden in a warehouse near Colombo, watching Dutch operatives replace genuine cinnamon shipments with inferior cassia bark, knowing that when these fraudulent spices reach European markets, Portuguese commercial credibility will suffer permanent damage among aristocratic customers who can distinguish authentic Ceylon cinnamon from Chinese substitutes by scent alone. The religious propaganda war adds another dimension as Dutch Protestant missionaries work to convince local Buddhist and Hindu communities that Portuguese Catholic colonizers represent a greater threat to traditional spiritual practices than Dutch commercial interests. The theological arguments become genuinely bizarre as Protestant ministers attempt to explain Calvinist predestination doctrine to Buddhist monks while both groups unite in opposing Catholic missionary activities that threaten to eliminate local religious traditions entirely. You attend a clandestine meeting in a remote temple where Dutch Reformed pastors and Buddhist abbots negotiate military cooperation agreements that would have been considered heretical impossibilities in European theological circles. The environmental destruction accelerates as both sides realize that controlling cinnamon production requires not just harvesting existing trees but also preventing enemies from establishing alternative supply sources. Portuguese forces begin systematic burning of wild cinnamon forests to deny Dutch forces access to unharvested bark, while Dutch commandos sneak through mountain passes to establish secret plantations in regions so remote that Portuguese maps don't even acknowledge their existence. The ecological warfare creates long-term environmental damage that will affect Ceylon's cinnamon industry for centuries after the immediate military conflict ends. The technological innovation emerges from necessity as both sides adapt European military equipment for jungle warfare conditions that no European manual anticipated. Dutch engineers develop lightweight cannons specifically designed for transport through mountain trails too narrow for traditional artillery, while Portuguese defenders create improvised fortifications using cinnamon logs that provide structural strength while filling defensive positions with aromatic smoke that can mask troop movements from enemy scouts. You watch Dutch soldiers testing experimental gunpowder mixtures that include ground cinnamon bark, reasoning that the familiar scent might confuse Portuguese forces during night attacks when identifying friend from foe becomes critically important. The psychological warfare tactics reach unprecedented levels of creativity as Dutch commanders exploit Portuguese colonial administrators' fundamental ignorance about local customs, languages, and geography. Dutch agents spread rumors in Tamil and Sinhala communities about Portuguese plans to destroy all Buddhist temples and Hindu shrines, knowing that local religious leaders will organize resistance movements that Portuguese forces cannot distinguish from ordinary civilian populations. The cultural manipulation proves devastatingly effective because Portuguese colonizers never bothered learning local languages or understanding religious practices they considered primitive superstitions. The logistical challenges create opportunities for innovation as Dutch forces develop supply networks that operate independently of traditional European colonial infrastructure. You follow Dutch supply convoys that use modified fishing boats to transport military equipment through coastal waterways that Portuguese naval patrols ignore, assuming that local fishermen pose no military threat. The Dutch understanding that successful colonial warfare requires winning local support rather than simply imposing European authority represents a fundamental shift in colonial military thinking that will influence imperial strategy for centuries. Historians still argue whether Dutch success in Ceylon resulted from superior military planning or simple Portuguese incompetence, but contemporary Dutch East India Company records reveal systematic preparation that treats every aspect of cinnamon warfare as a solvable logistical problem rather than a glorious military adventure. Company directors in Amsterdam received detailed reports about monsoon patterns, local political rivalries, and traditional harvesting techniques because they understand that sustainable cinnamon profits require working with Ceylon's existing social and economic systems rather than destroying them. The international implications multiply as other European powers begin studying Dutch cinnamon campaign tactics for application in their own colonial ventures. French military observers secretly document Dutch jungle warfare innovations while English intelligence networks map Dutch defensive positions, preparing for future interventions that will transform bilateral Dutch-Portuguese conflict into multilateral European competition for control of Ceylon's cinnamon resources. The precedent of using local allies against European competitors establishes a pattern that will define colonial warfare throughout Asia and Africa. The human cost becomes apparent in Portuguese colonial records that describe entire families of traditional cinnamon workers disappearing into Dutch-controlled territories, not as refugees fleeing violence but as skilled artisans choosing employers who offer better working conditions and higher wages. The economic defection proves more damaging to Portuguese interests than military defeats because cinnamon production requires generations of accumulated knowledge about optimal harvesting techniques, proper bark preparation, and sustainable grove management that cannot be replaced by importing European supervisors who lack essential local expertise. The cultural transformation of Ceylon during Dutch conquest creates lasting changes that extend far beyond immediate military objectives as Dutch administrators actively promote local education, language preservation, and traditional arts in deliberate contrast to Portuguese policies that attempted to eliminate indigenous culture through forced conversion and cultural suppression. You watch Dutch officials learning to write in Sinhala script while Portuguese administrators still require interpreters for basic communication with the communities they claim to govern. You're standing on the ramparts of Colombo Fort in 1796, watching British naval vessels blockade the harbor while Dutch defenders desperately attempt to negotiate surrender terms that might preserve some remnant of their cinnamon empire, completely unaware that the British East India Company has already drawn up detailed plans for transforming Ceylon into the crown jewel of their Asian spice monopoly. The British cinnamon takeover represents the final phase of European cinnamon wars, but unlike the chaotic brutality of Portuguese conquest or the methodical commercial warfare of Dutch occupation, British strategy combines industrial age efficiency with administrative sophistication that will create the template for modern corporate colonialism. The British approach to cinnamon conquest reflects lessons learned from observing a century of Dutch-Portuguese conflict, while avoiding the mistakes that weakened both previous colonial powers. You watch British intelligence officers who've spent decades studying Dutch colonial records, Portuguese administrative failures, and local political dynamics, preparing invasion plans that treat Ceylon conquest not as military adventure but as business acquisition requiring careful attention to existing infrastructure, workforce management, and supply chain optimization. The corporate mentality is unmistakable. British commanders discuss cinnamon plantations using the same language Manchester factory owners use when calculating textile production costs. The timing of British intervention exploits European political chaos as revolutionary France threatens Dutch independence, forcing the Dutch East India Company to choose between defending homeland territories and maintaining distant colonial possessions. You're eavesdropping on secret meetings in Amsterdam where company directors debate abandoning Ceylon to concentrate resources on more profitable Indonesian spice islands, not realizing that British agents have already begun recruiting Dutch colonial administrators who face unemployment if company operations contract. The economic warfare begins before the first British soldier sets foot on Ceylon's soil. The military campaign unfolds with mechanical precision as British forces systematically capture strategic positions using tactics developed during decades of Indian subcontinent warfare, where they learned to coordinate European military technology with local auxiliary forces recruited from communities alienated by existing colonial administrations. You watch Sepoy regiments, composed of Indian soldiers trained in European fighting techniques, advance through cinnamon groves alongside British regulars while Tamil and Sinhalese guides who remember Portuguese brutality and Dutch commercial exploitation eagerly provide intelligence about Dutch defensive positions. The propaganda warfare reaches new levels of sophistication as British administrators promise local communities greater autonomy, better working conditions, and respect for traditional religious practices while simultaneously planning the most intensive cinnamon extraction program in colonial history. The contradictions are breathtaking. British officials genuinely believe they can improve local living standards while dramatically increasing production quotas that will require more intensive labor than Dutch or Portuguese systems ever demanded. You attend village meetings where British representatives explain their benevolent intentions while military engineers survey the same villages for optimal plantation layouts that will eliminate traditional subsistence farming. The technological revolution accompanying British takeover transforms cinnamon production from seasonal harvesting of wild trees into industrial agriculture using cultivation techniques developed in Caribbean sugar plantations and American cotton fields. British agricultural experts import steam-powered processing equipment, mechanical bark stripping devices, and scientific drying methods that increase production efficiency while reducing the skilled labor requirements that gave traditional cinnamon workers bargaining power under previous colonial administrations. The industrialization of spice production represents a fundamental shift from extractive colonialism to productive colonialism that will define the next century of imperial expansion. The administrative innovation proves even more significant than military conquest as British colonial officers implement bureaucratic systems designed to prevent the corruption, inefficiency, and local resistance that plagued Dutch and Portuguese cinnamon operations. You examine British administrative manuals that treat colonial government as a management science requiring careful measurement of production statistics, worker productivity, and profit margins with the same attention to detail that characterizes successful industrial enterprises. The professionalization of colonial administration represents the emergence of modern imperial bureaucracy. The environmental transformation accelerates under British management as colonial botanists systematically replace wild cinnamon forests with organized plantations designed for maximum yield rather than ecological sustainability. British agricultural scientists import cultivation techniques from other tropical colonies while ignoring local knowledge about sustainable harvesting practices that had maintained Ceylon's cinnamon resources for over a millennium. You watch traditional cinnamon groves being clear-cut to make room for geometric plantation rows that maximize short-term production, while destroying the complex forest ecosystems that naturally protected cinnamon trees from pests and diseases. Historians still argue whether British cinnamon policies represented enlightened colonialism or simply more efficient exploitation, but contemporary British East India Company documents reveal careful planning that prioritizes long-term profitability over immediate extraction. Recognizing that sustainable cinnamon revenues require maintaining productive capacity rather than exhausting resources through intensive harvesting. The corporate approach treats Ceylon as a permanent investment rather than a temporary opportunity for quick profits. The cultural impact of British takeover creates lasting changes that extend far beyond cinnamon production as British administrators implement educational systems, legal frameworks, and transportation infrastructure designed to support intensive agricultural production while maintaining social stability. The British understanding that effective colonial control requires winning local cooperation rather than imposing foreign authority through violence represents a sophisticated evolution of colonial strategy that learns from Portuguese failures and Dutch limitations. The international implications multiply as British control of Ceylon cinnamon establishes their dominance in global spice markets, eliminating the last independent sources of high-quality cinnamon that might challenge British commercial monopoly. French and Spanish attempts to establish alternative cinnamon plantations in their own colonies fail because British control of Ceylon's superior genetic varieties and accumulated cultivation knowledge creates insurmountable competitive advantages. You watch British botanists carefully guarding cinnamon seedlings being shipped to experimental plantations in India and the Caribbean, understanding that genetic monopoly matters more than territorial control. The economic transformation proves more significant than political conquest as British cinnamon operations generate revenues that help finance industrial expansion in Britain while creating demand for British manufactured goods in Ceylon markets. The circular economic relationship. Colonial agricultural profits, funding metropolitan industrial development, while colonial markets consume metropolitan industrial products, establishes the fundamental structure of modern global capitalism that will define economic relationships between developed and developing nations for the next 2 centuries. The precedent established by British cinnamon takeover, that successful colonialism requires combining military conquest with administrative efficiency, technological innovation, and economic integration, will be copied in every subsequent British colonial venture, from African diamond mines to Australian wool ranches to Canadian timber forests. Creating a global imperial system that treats natural resources as inputs for metropolitan industrial production, while treating colonial populations as labor forces for resource extraction and markets for manufactured goods consumption. You're kneeling beside the mass grave of an entire Bandanese village in 1621, counting small skulls while Dutch colonial records describe the victims as obstacles to commercial optimization. And you realize that the most horrific aspect of the spice wars isn't the violence itself, but how systematically European colonizers erased the very existence of the indigenous peoples whose civilizations they destroyed for aromatic seeds and bark. The forgotten victims of nutmeg, pepper, and cinnamon wars number in the millions, yet their stories disappeared beneath layers of colonial propaganda that reframed genocide as commercial necessity and cultural extinction as civilizing progress. The Banda Islands genocide represents the most complete example of spice-motivated ethnic cleansing, as Dutch forces systematically eliminated the entire indigenous population to establish their nutmeg monopoly. You watch Dutch soldiers methodically burning traditional Bandanese libraries, destroying oral history traditions, and executing elderly community members who possess centuries of accumulated knowledge about sustainable nutmeg cultivation, navigation techniques, and traditional medicine. The cultural destruction proves more devastating than the immediate violence because it eliminates any possibility that Bandanese civilization might survive in memory or practice. Contemporary Dutch records describe the extermination as clearing obstacles to efficient plantation management, using language that treats human beings as agricultural problems requiring technical solutions. The demographic catastrophe extends far beyond direct violence, as European diseases, introduced through colonial contact, devastate indigenous populations who lack immunity to smallpox, typhus, and bubonic plague that European traders carry throughout the spice-producing regions. You're walking through abandoned villages in Kerala where entire pepper farming communities died not from Portuguese bullets but from European pathogens that spread faster than military conquest, eliminating traditional agricultural knowledge that took generations to develop. The biological warfare proves unintentional but more effective than deliberate military campaigns, creating depopulated regions that European colonizers can claim as empty land, suitable for plantation development. The enslavement of survivors creates another category of forgotten victims, as European spice operations require intensive labor that colonial administrators obtain through systematic kidnapping, debt bondage, and forced migration of indigenous peoples from regions throughout the Indian Ocean. You examine Portuguese shipping records that list cargo manifests including hundreds of Tamil and Sinhalese workers transported to cinnamon plantations as human property, their names replaced by inventory numbers that treat skilled agricultural specialists as interchangeable commodities. The slave trade supporting spice production operates on scales that rival the better-known Atlantic slave trade while receiving virtually no historical attention because spice plantation slavery occurred in remote tropical regions where European observers rarely traveled. The environmental destruction accompanying spice colonization eliminates indigenous communities indirectly by destroying the ecological systems that supported traditional subsistence patterns for over a millennium. You watch Dutch colonial engineers diverting river systems to irrigate nutmeg plantations, creating droughts that forced traditional fishing and farming communities to abandon ancestral territories where their families had lived since before the birth of Christ. The ecological warfare proves particularly devastating because indigenous communities throughout the spice regions had developed sophisticated environmental management techniques that maintained biological diversity while supporting human populations. But European plantation agriculture eliminates this ecological knowledge along with the communities that created it. The linguistic genocide represents another dimension of cultural destruction, as European colonizers systematically eliminate indigenous languages that contain irreplaceable knowledge about spice cultivation, traditional medicine, and sustainable agricultural practices. You listen to the last native speaker of an extinct Moluccan language attempting to teach Dutch colonial administrators the traditional names for different nutmeg varieties, not realizing that the colonizers consider indigenous agricultural terminology irrelevant because European botanical classification systems will replace traditional knowledge with scientific nomenclature that ignores centuries of local experimentation and observation. The religious persecution accompanying spice colonization targets indigenous spiritual practices that Europeans consider obstacles to efficient labor management and commercial development. Portuguese colonial records describe systematic destruction of Hindu and Buddhist temples throughout pepper-producing regions, not for theological reasons but because traditional religious festivals interfered with plantation work schedules and traditional religious authorities provided alternative leadership that might organize resistance to colonial exploitation. You watched Portuguese soldiers burning ancient Sanskrit manuscripts that contained traditional Ayurvedic medical knowledge about spice-based treatments, eliminating healing traditions that had sustained local communities for centuries. Historians still argue whether European spice colonizers intended to eliminate indigenous cultures or simply considered cultural destruction an acceptable cost of commercial development. But contemporary colonial documents reveal administrators who clearly understood that maintaining indigenous communities would limit European control over spice production, and therefore chose systematic cultural elimination as the most efficient path to commercial monopoly. The bureaucratic language treating genocide as administrative efficiency reveals the corporate mentality that prioritizes profit margins over human survival. The women and children suffer disproportionately as European spice operations specifically target indigenous family structures, recognizing that traditional kinship networks provide the social organization necessary for resistance movements. You discover Dutch colonial policies that deliberately separate indigenous families to prevent cultural transmission between generations, forcing children into European supervised educational programs designed to eliminate traditional languages, religious practices, and agricultural knowledge while training them as compliant plantation workers who lack connection to indigenous communities that might support resistance activities. The intellectual property theft represents another category of colonial violence, as European botanists systematically document indigenous agricultural knowledge while eliminating the communities that created this knowledge, then patent traditional cultivation techniques as European discoveries that generate profits for metropolitan commercial interests. You examine British botanical surveys that record detailed descriptions of traditional cinnamon harvesting methods learned from Sinhalese specialists, then classify this knowledge as proprietary British agricultural science that can be exported to other colonial territories without acknowledging indigenous origins or providing compensation to surviving community members. The international amnesia surrounding spice war victims reflects deliberate European efforts to rewrite colonial history as civilizing missions rather than commercial exploitation, creating historical narratives that emphasize European technological progress while ignoring the human costs of imperial expansion. Colonial museums throughout Europe display spice specimens and plantation equipment, while omitting any mention of the indigenous peoples who died to produce these commercial products, creating sanitized versions of colonial history that treat spice production as technical achievement rather than cultural destruction. The psychological trauma experienced by surviving indigenous communities creates lasting effects that persist for generations as survivors struggle to maintain traditional practices while adapting to colonial systems that actively discourage indigenous cultural expression. You meet elderly Sinhalese cinnamon workers who remember traditional harvesting songs but can only sing them in secret because colonial administrators consider indigenous music a form of resistance that might inspire nostalgia for pre-colonial independence. The cultural suppression creates internal conflicts for survivors who must choose between preserving traditional knowledge and ensuring their family's survival under colonial authority. The memorial silence surrounding spice war victims reveals how successfully European colonizers eliminated indigenous perspectives from historical records, creating archives that document colonial administrative achievements while ignoring the experiences of colonized peoples who constituted the majority of affected populations. Remember that pepper powder bomb incident from our earlier adventure? Well, these innovative resistance tactics represent just tiny fragments of indigenous knowledge systems that were systematically destroyed to make room for European commercial agriculture that treated traditional communities as obstacles to efficient plantation management. You're standing in a modern corporate boardroom in Singapore circa 2024, watching multinational spice company executives make strategic decisions using the exact same logic that Dutch East India Company directors employed when planning the Banda Islands genocide. And you realize that the fundamental power structures created by 3 centuries of spice wars have simply evolved into contemporary forms that maintain the same patterns of exploitation while using more sophisticated public relations language to obscure their colonial origins. The modern spice legacy isn't ancient history, It's the living foundation of today's global economic system that still treats agricultural resources as strategic assets worth killing for and indigenous communities as obstacles to commercial optimization. The contemporary spice trade operates through corporate structures that directly descend from colonial trading companies, with multinational corporations controlling production, processing, and distribution networks that span the same territories where Portuguese, Dutch, and British forces fought their bloody wars for commercial monopoly. You examine the shareholder reports of modern spice conglomerates that own vast plantations throughout Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and southern India, using language about supply chain efficiency and market optimization that euphemistically describes the same extractive relationships that characterized colonial spice operations, except now indigenous communities face economic coercion rather than military conquest to surrender control of their traditional agricultural resources. The genetic monopolization represents perhaps the most sophisticated evolution of colonial spice control, as multinational agricultural corporations use patent law and biotechnology to achieve the same monopolistic dominance that European colonizers once maintained through military force. You discover corporate research facilities where scientists modify traditional spice varieties developed over centuries by indigenous farmers, then patent these innovations as proprietary corporate intellectual property that allows companies to collect royalties from the descendants of communities that originally created the genetic resources. The legal theft of traditional agricultural knowledge proves more efficient than colonial violence because it uses international trade law to legitimize extraction that would have required military occupation under previous imperial systems. The environmental destruction continues under corporate management, as industrial spice production eliminates the biodiversity that traditional indigenous agriculture maintained for over a millennium, replacing complex ecological systems with monoculture plantations that maximize short-term yields while creating long-term environmental problems that will affect regional ecosystems for generations. You watch satellite imagery showing vast areas of Indonesian rainforest being clear-cut to expand nutmeg and pepper plantations using techniques that prioritize immediate profits over ecological sustainability, continuing the same pattern of environmental exploitation that characterized colonial spice operations while using modern technology to accelerate the destruction. The labor exploitation persists through contract farming systems that bind contemporary spice workers to multinational corporations using debt structures that create the same economic dependency that characterized colonial plantation systems. Except modern corporate contracts use legal language rather than physical coercion to prevent workers from seeking alternative employment or negotiating better working conditions. You examine corporate procurement policies that guarantee farmers below subsistence prices for their spice crops while requiring them to purchase expensive seeds, fertilizers, and processing equipment exclusively from the same corporations that buy their harvests, creating debt cycles that trap farming families in permanent economic subordination. The trade route domination continues as the same European and American financial institutions that emerged from colonial spice profits now control the commodity exchanges, shipping networks, and processing facilities that determine global spice prices, maintaining the same concentration of commercial power that colonial trading companies once exercised through military force. You discover that the London Metal Exchange, which sets international spice prices, operates from the same financial district that housed the Dutch East India Company's European headquarters, using computerized trading algorithms that achieve the same market manipulation that colonial monopolies once maintained through controlling physical supply chains. The political influence networks reveal how spice industry lobbying perpetuates colonial-era policies that prioritize corporate profits over indigenous rights, environmental protection, and fair labor practices. Using campaign contributions and regulatory capture to maintain legal frameworks that facilitate continued extraction of agricultural resources from developing nations for consumption in wealthy metropolitan markets. You examine legislative records showing how spice industry associations successfully oppose international trade regulations that might require fair compensation for traditional agricultural knowledge or environmental protection measures that might increase production costs. Historians still argue whether contemporary spice industry practices represent continuity with colonial exploitation or legitimate business evolution, but corporate internal documents reveal strategic planning that explicitly treats traditional spice-producing communities as obstacles to efficiency that must be eliminated through economic pressure rather than military conquest. Using the same logic that justified colonial genocide while employing more sophisticated methods that avoid international legal complications. The corporate mentality that treats human communities as production inputs and environmental systems as free resources directly continues colonial administrative thinking. The cultural appropriation reaches industrial scales as multinational food corporations market authentic spice products using romanticized imagery of traditional production methods while systematically eliminating the actual traditional communities that developed these agricultural techniques, creating consumer fantasies about exotic spice origins that obscure the reality of corporate plantation agriculture that has replaced indigenous farming systems throughout the spice-producing regions. You watch marketing campaigns that celebrate ancient spice traditions, while the same companies lobby against international agreements that might provide legal protection for the indigenous communities that created these traditions. The financial networks reveal how contemporary banks, insurance companies, and investment funds that control spice industry financing can trace their corporate genealogies directly to colonial trading companies that accumulated their initial capital through spice war profits, creating institutional continuities that maintain the same concentration of economic power that characterized the colonial period while using modern financial instruments to extract wealth from spice-producing regions for investment in metropolitan financial markets. The colonial extraction continues but has evolved from physical shipments of spices to electronic transfers of financial profits. The technological surveillance systems used by modern spice corporations to monitor plantation workers, track agricultural production, and prevent theft of genetic materials employ digital methods to achieve the same total control over indigenous communities that colonial administrators once maintained through military occupation, except contemporary surveillance operates through satellite monitoring, biometric identification, and digital payment systems that create more comprehensive control than colonial authorities could ever achieve through physical presence alone. The international development programs funded by spice industry foundations use humanitarian rhetoric to promote agricultural modernization projects that eliminate traditional farming practices in favor of corporate-controlled production systems, continuing the colonial mission of replacing indigenous knowledge with European technical expertise while generating profits for the same multinational corporations that fund the development programs. You examine foundation reports that describe traditional spice cultivation as inefficient and backward, while promoting industrial agriculture as scientific progress, using the same civilizing mission language that justified colonial conquest. The supply chain complexity allows contemporary consumers to purchase spice products without understanding the colonial origins of the corporate structures that control production, processing, and distribution, creating psychological distance between metropolitan consumption and colonial extraction that enables continued exploitation while maintaining consumer ignorance about the historical and contemporary violence that brings exotic flavors to suburban supermarket shelves. The corporate public relations machinery works overtime to maintain romantic fantasies about spice origins while concealing the reality of continued colonial extraction that operates through economic coercion rather than military conquest. Remember that cinnamon-scented air from our Ceylon jungle adventure? Well, that same aromatic sweetness now masks the bitter reality that the spice wars never actually ended. They just learned to wear business suits and use lawyers instead of soldiers to maintain the same extractive relationships that have connected European consumption with tropical exploitation for over 5 centuries of continuous colonial violence disguised as commercial progress. You're floating above the earth in some impossible vantage point, watching the red stains of spice war battlefields fade into the green of recovering forests, while the golden threads of modern trade routes pulse with the same extractive rhythms that have connected European tables with tropical suffering for over 500 years. And you finally understand that the true cost of humanity's obsession with flavoring food extends far beyond the millions who died in forgotten conflicts over nutmeg, pepper, and cinnamon. It reaches into the fundamental structure of how our species organizes economic relationships, treats indigenous knowledge, and justifies violence in pursuit of commercial advantage. The mathematical horror becomes clear when you attempt to calculate the actual human cost of spice wars across 5 centuries of colonial extraction, realizing that conventional casualty statistics only capture direct military deaths while ignoring the exponentially larger numbers who died from disease, starvation, displacement, and cultural destruction that accompanied European spice colonization. Conservative estimates suggest that Portuguese pepper wars alone killed over 200,000 people along India's Malabar coast, while Dutch nutmeg monopolization eliminated virtually the entire indigenous population of the Banda Islands, and British cinnamon operations displaced hundreds of thousands of traditional farming families throughout Ceylon. But these documented casualties represent merely the visible fraction of a demographic catastrophe that eliminated entire civilizations, whose contributions to human knowledge about sustainable agriculture, traditional medicine, and environmental management can never be recovered or replaced. The psychological revelation proves even more disturbing than the numerical calculations as you recognize that European spice colonizers weren't uniquely evil individuals but ordinary people operating within economic and cultural systems that normalized genocide as acceptable business practice, suggesting that contemporary global capitalism contains the same structural incentives that justified colonial violence, and could easily reproduce similar atrocities whenever profitable opportunities emerge in regions where indigenous communities control valuable natural resources. The bureaucratic language that colonial administrators used to describe mass murder as commercial optimization closely resembles the corporate rhetoric that multinational companies use today when discussing supply chain efficiency and market penetration, strategies that systematically eliminate traditional communities and replace indigenous agriculture with industrial plantation systems. The pattern recognition becomes unavoidable as you trace how spice war tactics divide local communities, eliminate traditional leadership, introduce economic dependency, monopolize essential resources, use superior technology to maintain control, have been refined and repeated in every subsequent phase of global economic expansion. From rubber plantations to banana republics to rare earth mineral extraction to contemporary land grabbing for palm oil production and carbon offset schemes that displace indigenous communities in the name of environmental protection while generating profits for the same multinational corporations that control traditional extractive industries. The moral complexity deepens when you realize that virtually every person living in developed nations participates in economic systems built on spice war foundations, consuming products processed using agricultural techniques stolen from indigenous communities, purchasing goods from companies whose corporate genealogies trace back to colonial trading enterprises, and benefiting from infrastructure development financed through centuries of extractive profits while remaining largely ignorant about the colonial origins of their material prosperity. The complicity isn't intentional but it's structural. Contemporary metropolitan consumption depends on continued extraction from developing nations using power relationships established during the original spice wars and maintained through legal, financial, and technological systems that achieve the same results as colonial military occupation. The environmental legacy reveals how spice war environmental destruction created precedents for treating natural ecosystems as industrial inputs rather than complex living systems that require careful stewardship, establishing the extractive mentality that now threatens global ecological stability through climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution patterns that reflect the same short-term profit maximization logic that colonial spice operations used when they eliminated traditional, sustainable agriculture in favor of intensive plantation monocultures that maximized immediate yields while creating long-term environmental problems that affect entire regional ecosystems. Historians still argue whether contemporary global problems represent inevitable consequences of technological development, or specific results of colonial extraction patterns that could have developed differently if European expansion had emphasized cooperation rather than conquest. But the archaeological evidence from abandoned spice-producing regions reveals sophisticated traditional agricultural systems that maintain ecological balance while supporting dense human populations for over a millennium before colonial intervention replaced sustainable indigenous practices with extractive plantation agriculture that depleted soil, eliminated biodiversity, and created the environmental problems that continue to affect these regions centuries after political independence. The technological irony becomes apparent when you discover that many contemporary solutions to global environmental and social problems involve rediscovering traditional indigenous knowledge that colonial spice operations systematically eliminated, forcing modern scientists to reconstruct sustainable agricultural techniques, traditional medical practices, and ecological management systems that indigenous communities had perfected over centuries of careful experimentation and observation before. European colonizers decided that indigenous knowledge was primitive superstition that needed to be replaced with superior European scientific understanding that prioritized short-term commercial profits over long-term ecological sustainability. The educational implications suggest that understanding spice war history could provide essential knowledge for addressing contemporary global challenges. But educational systems throughout the developed world continue to present colonial expansion as technological progress rather than systematic violence, creating historical narratives that celebrate European exploration and commercial development, while ignoring the human and environmental costs of imperial expansion that established the extractive economic relationships that continue to characterize global trade in agricultural commodities, mineral resources, and manufactured goods. The psychological defense mechanisms that allow contemporary consumers to purchase spice products without thinking about their colonial origins closely resemble the mental processes that allowed colonial administrators to organize genocide while considering themselves civilized Christians bringing progress to backward regions, suggesting that human psychology contains systematic biases that facilitate participation in exploitative systems by creating psychological distance between individual actions and systemic consequences that makes it possible for ordinary people to contribute to extraordinary violence without recognizing their moral complicity. The cyclical nature of extractive violence becomes clear when you examine how contemporary conflicts over lithium for electric car batteries, cobalt for smartphone manufacturing, and rare earth elements for renewable energy technology reproduce the same patterns of metropolitan consumption driving violence in resource-rich developing regions that characterize the original spice wars, suggesting that technological change alone cannot eliminate extractive relationships without fundamental changes in the legal, financial, and cultural systems that normalize treating indigenous communities as obstacles to commercial development and natural resources as free inputs for industrial production. The ultimate question emerges from recognizing that spice wars established the foundational patterns of modern global capitalism. Can human societies develop economic systems that provide material prosperity without requiring extractive relationships between metropolitan consumers and peripheral producers? Or are the same structural incentives that justified colonial genocide inherent in any economic system that prioritizes individual consumption and capital accumulation over community, sustainability, and ecological balance? The spice wars ended officially when political control shifted from colonial trading companies to independent national governments. But the economic relationships that motivated the original violence continue operating through multinational corporations, international financial institutions, and trade agreements that maintain the same concentration of economic power that characterized colonial spice monopolies. The haunting realization settles over you like cinnamon-scented smoke from a burning village. We never stopped fighting spice wars, we just learned to disguise colonial extraction as international commerce, technological progress, and humanitarian development, while maintaining the same extractive relationships that connect metropolitan consumption with peripheral violence. And until human societies develop economic systems that prioritize ecological sustainability and social justice over profit maximization and capital accumulation, the fundamental logic that justified killing millions of people for aromatic seeds and bark will continue operating through contemporary forms that may eventually produce atrocities that make the original spice wars look like minor commercial disagreements. The gentle rhythm of your breathing slows as these heavy truths settle into the quiet spaces between thoughts, like spice dust floating in shafts of moonlight through a darkened kitchen. Your body relaxes deeper into familiar comfort as you realize that understanding these patterns, however disturbing, provides the knowledge necessary for choosing different paths forward. The weight of history transforms into the possibility of wisdom as your consciousness drifts toward the peaceful realm of sleep, where dreams might weave new patterns from old knowledge, creating visions of human societies that have learned to flavor their food without flavoring it with blood. The last whisper of awareness fades into the soft darkness of rest, carrying with it the gentle hope that tomorrow's choices might honor both the forgotten victims and the surviving wisdom that outlasted all the violence, creating flavors of justice seasoned with compassion and garnished with remembrance.